Everyone tells you that the first year of marriage is the hardest. They expect you to fight about whose turn it is to take out the trash, or the fact that he leaves his wet towel on the bathroom floor. They warn you about the merging of finances and the tricky dynamics of dealing with new in-laws. What they don't tell you is what to do when you find out, exactly 12 days after walking down the aisle, that your husband's entire existence, his job, his background, the very name printed on your marriage certificate, was a carefully constructed illusion. But that's not the craziest part of this story. The crazy part is that I didn't confront him. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a coffee mug at the wall, and I didn't pack a bag in the middle of the night to flee to my parents' house. Instead, I made him his favorite morning coffee, kissed him on the cheek, and spent the next 3 months quietly and systematically erasing him from my life. My name is Sarah, and to understand how I pulled this off, you have to understand how my brain works. I am a forensic auditor for a massive corporate logistics firm based out of Chicago. My entire career is built on finding the one single number out of place in a spreadsheet of thousands. My dad, who raised me by himself after my mom passed away when I was little, used to play this observation game with me at local diners. He'd point to a couple across the room and say, "Tell me their story, kid." He taught me to look at the scuff marks on shoes, the way people nervously held their forks, the micro-expressions that flash across a face when someone is telling a lie. He used to say, "People will tell you exactly who they are, Sarah. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." I really thought I was listening when I met Marcus. We met at a charity gala I didn't even want to go to. I was wearing a dress that was slightly too tight, sipping terrible, overpriced champagne, and calculating exactly how early I could leave without being considered rude. Then, Marcus bumped into me, literally. He spilled a drop of his drink on my shoe. And his apology was so genuine, so charmingly flustered, that I couldn't even bring myself to be mad. He told me he was an environmental consultant, traveling the country to help corporations reduce their carbon footprints. He had this warm, booming laugh that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He remembered the names of my friends after meeting them only once. He brought me homemade soup when I had a bad cold. He was, by every conventional metric, the ultimate catch. My dad liked him, but my dad also had this habit of narrowing his eyes when Marcus talked about his past. Marcus claimed his parents had passed away when he was in his 20s and that he was an only child. He had friends, sure, but they were mostly people he'd met recently at the gym or through networking. There were no childhood best friends, no college buddies he still grabbed a beer with on the weekends. When I asked him about it once, he just looked a little sad, squeezed my hand, and said, "I've moved around so much, Sarah. You're the first real home I've ever had." It was the perfect answer. It completely disarmed my logical brain and went straight for my heart. We dated for a year and a half before he proposed. The wedding was intimate. Just 50 people at a beautiful little vineyard in Michigan. It was genuinely the happiest day of my life. I remember looking at him as we said our vows under the string lights, feeling this overwhelming sense of peace. I had a beautiful home that I had inherited from my grandfather, a thriving career, and now, a husband who looked at me like I hung the moon. 12 days later, the moon fell out of the sky. It was a Tuesday. Marcus was out of town on a consulting trip in Denver. I was working from home, organizing my home office, trying to make room for his files in the filing cabinet. He had this heavy, vintage leather briefcase that he always kept locked. He joked that it contained highly classified environmental data and trade secrets. But that morning, I noticed the metal latch was slightly askew. He had been in a massive rush for his early flight and hadn't clicked it shut properly. I swear to you, I didn't open it because I suspected him. I opened it because I knocked it over with the vacuum cord, and the contents spilled all over the hardwood floor. As I knelt down to gather the scattered papers, my eyes caught a bank statement. The logo was for a bank we didn't use. I picked it up, expecting to see some old, forgotten college account of his. Instead, I saw a name I didn't recognize, Arthur Pendleton. I frowned, my brow furrowing in confusion. The address on the statement was a P.O. box in Nevada. I kept digging through the spilled papers. There was a birth certificate, not for Marcus Vance, but for Arthur Pendleton. There was a passport, expired, with Marcus's face smiling back at me, under the name Arthur. My heart started doing this slow, heavy pounding against my ribs. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I felt entirely numb. I sat down cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the spilled secrets of the man I had just promised my life to, and I did what I do best. I audited him. At the very bottom of the briefcase was a yellow legal pad. It was filled with messy, handwritten notes. My name was circled at the top of the first page. Underneath, it was a meticulously bulleted list of my financial assets. The exact market value of my grandfather's house, the estimated amount in my 401k, my annual salary down to the dollar. And then there was a timeline. Month 1. Suggest refinancing the house for renovations. Month 2, get name added to the deed. Month 3, pull equity loan. I stopped breathing. The man I married didn't love me. He was a professional parasite. He had engineered our entire relationship, probably from the exact moment he accidentally bumped into me at that gala. He knew about my inheritance before he even knew my favorite color. The instinct to panic was completely overwhelming. I wanted to call the police immediately. I wanted to call my dad and cry. I wanted to drag the briefcase into the backyard and set it on fire. But then, a strange, eerie calm washed over me. It was the exact same icy calm I feel when I find a multi-million-dollar discrepancy in a shady corporate ledger. If I confronted him right now, it would be a messy, he said, she said situation. He could claim it was research for a novel, or a misunderstanding. Or worse, he could panic and do something drastic. I was alone in the house. I had no idea what this man was truly capable of. So I carefully put every single paper back exactly as I found it. I snapped the briefcase locked. I pushed it back under his desk. And then I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of chamomile tea. When Marcus came home 3 days later, I was waiting by the front door. I threw my arms around his neck, breathed in the familiar, comforting scent of his expensive cologne, and smiled against his shoulder. "I missed you so much," I whispered. It was the first lie of many, and honestly, it tasted like ash in my mouth. The next 3 months were an excruciating, Oscar-worthy performance. I was the perfect, doting, hopelessly in love wife. We cooked dinner together, we watched movies on the couch, we planned a future that I knew was entirely fictional. And while he thought he was playing me like a fiddle, I was quietly dismantling his entire life. I hired a private investigator who specialized in high-level financial fraud. I didn't use our joint account to pay him, obviously. I used a separate, secure account Marcus didn't know existed. What the PI found was staggering. Marcus had done this before. He had a long, devastating trail of maxed out credit cards, abandoned leases, and broken engagements across 3 different states, always operating under different aliases. He specifically targeted independent, successful women, drained their liquid assets, and vanished like a ghost right before the wedding. But with me, he had hit the absolute jackpot. The historic house I inherited was worth well over $1 million, and it was fully paid off. He married me because it was the only way he could legally get his hands on that kind of equity. Meanwhile, I quietly met with a ruthless, brilliant divorce attorney named Brenda. Brenda took one look at the evidence file my PI put together, pushed her thick glasses up her nose, and smiled a smile that chilled my blood in the absolute best way possible. "Oh, honey," she said, tapping her pen against the desk. "We are going to legally crucify this man. We drafted an annulment based on fraud. In our state, if you can prove your spouse lied about their identity or intentions to the extent that it goes to the core of the marriage itself, you can get it wiped from the public books like it never even happened. But more importantly, we gathered enough concrete financial evidence to hand over to the authorities for federal wire fraud and identity theft." The hardest part was playing along with his timeline. Right on schedule, in month 2, he brought up the house. We were sitting on the back patio, drinking red wine as the sun went down. He reached across the table, took my hand, and kissed my knuckles. "You know, Sarah," he said, using that soft, trustworthy, incredibly persuasive voice, "I was thinking about the kitchen. You've always wanted to update it. What if we added my name to the deed, and we could take out a joint equity line? We could finally build your dream kitchen." I looked deep into his eyes. They were so warm, so flawlessly convincing. It terrified me how remarkably good he was at this. I had to physically force myself not to pull my hand away in disgust. Instead, I smiled sweetly, my heart hammering 1,000,000 miles a minute in my throat, and said, "That sounds like a really smart idea, honey. Let's do it." I told him I'd have my family's lawyer draw up the paperwork because my grandfather's trust required very specific legal formatting. He readily agreed, probably thrilled and thinking I was making his job easier. We scheduled the signing for a Friday afternoon at the house. He thought we were signing the deed transfer and the massive loan applications. He wore a crisp, tailored blue suit. He even bought me a bouquet of expensive flowers on the way home. He was practically vibrating with excitement, thinking he was finally crossing the finish line. I had arranged for a mobile notary to come to the house. Only, it wasn't just a notary. It was the notary, my attorney Brenda, and 2 plainclothes detectives who had been building a massive federal case based on the files my PI had handed over. When Marcus confidently walked into the dining room and saw the serious-looking strangers sitting around our table, he stopped dead in his tracks. The charming smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before he hastily plastered it back on. "Hey, honey," he said, his eyes nervously darting around the room. I didn't realize we were having a party. I stood at the head of the mahogany table. I didn't smile. I didn't yell. I just looked at him, not as Marcus, my loving husband, but as Arthur, the pathetic con man. "Have a seat, Arthur," I said quietly. The color drained from his face so fast, I honestly thought he might pass out right there on the rug. He didn't move. He didn't say a single word. He just stared at me, realizing in real time that the script had completely flipped. Brenda pushed a thick stack of papers across the table. "These are the annulment papers," she said, her voice sharp, cold, and entirely professional. "They detail the extensive fraud you committed to induce my client into this marriage. You will sign them right now, waiving any and all rights to her property, or we proceed to a lengthy, highly public civil trial." One of the detectives slowly stood up and flashed his shiny badge. "And immediately after you sign those, Mr. Pendleton, we have a warrant for your arrest regarding multiple federal wire fraud charges spanning your time in Colorado and Nevada." I will never, ever forget the look in his eyes in that moment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even fear. It was sheer, unadulterated shock. He had completely underestimated me. He looked at me, the woman he thought was an easy, naive, trusting mark, and realized he had walked willingly into an airtight trap that I had spent 3 months building around him. He didn't fight. Bullies and con men rarely do when they are backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. He slowly sat down, his hands shaking visibly, and signed the annulment papers. The detectives casually read him his rights, clicked the cold metal handcuffs around his wrists, and walked him out of my front door. I stood on the porch and watched the unmarked police car pull away down the street. The neighborhood was perfectly quiet. The sun was shining brightly. I took a deep, long breath, and for the first time in 90 agonizing days, the air tasted clean. People always ask me how I managed to stay so calm. They ask how I slept next to an absolute monster for 3 months without giving myself away. The truth is, I was terrified. There were nights I lay wide awake, listening to him breathe in the dark, my chest tight, wondering if he knew that I knew. But my dad's voice always echoed clearly in my head. You just have to pay attention. I didn't let emotion dictate my survival. I used logic. I used extreme patience. I let him believe he was the smartest person in the room right up until the exact moment the cell door slammed shut. My dad drove down from Michigan the very next day. We sat on the same back patio where Arthur had tried to steal my future. My dad poured us both a glass of his favorite aged bourbon. He clinked his glass against mine and looked at me with this profound, quiet, incredibly deep pride. I taught you to pay attention, kid, he said softly. But I never thought you'd have to use it quite like that. Neither did I, Dad, I replied, taking a sip. I didn't sell the house. I renovated the kitchen myself, exactly the way I wanted it, with my own money. I didn't let the terrifying experience make me bitter, but I absolutely let it make me sharper. I still believe in love, and I still believe in trust, but I also firmly believe that a woman's greatest weapon isn't her anger, it's her patience. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge you can ever get isn't a screaming match or a dramatic, violent scene. Sometimes, it's just looking the person who tried to destroy you directly in the eye, and quietly, legally, erasing them from your universe forever. Wow, what a completely wild and intense story. If you found this as crazy as I did, or if you've ever had a gut feeling that ended up being absolutely right, I want to hear about it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please hit that like button to help support the channel, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another unbelievable story. See you in the next one.